Is not very good, so I'm not expecting the people from about the third or fourth row back to see it. What this is a picture of a 7.5 pound bass which has got a mackerel stuck down its throat head first. That's what the picture is. What we're absolutely convinced by is that when you're using a live bait, a bass will come along and it will hit it sideways on, and then in a second motion it will come back round and take the mackerel, and it will take that dead or dying mackerel head first. So we're absolutely convinced about this. We've caught bass in this sort of situation where the mackerel stayed on. Most of the time the bass will shake the mackerel off. But we've also had the hit but never the follow-up take, and that's not an unusual occurrence. And when you get that mackerel back, it's been really badly beaten. It's like somebody's grabbed hold of it and gone like that, just behind the head. So we're convinced that that's what the bass are doing. And that means that you've got to be phenomenally patient, particularly with circle hooks. So that, Nigel, if you think about, you see that silly little loop? Can you just hold the silly little loop to start with? If you think about that 6-foot trace, that mackerel, that live bait, can swim around in a sphere which has got a 12-foot diameter, so that mackerel can be all over the place. And when you're on the drift, you'll get a rattle going through the rod tip as a big bass comes near a mackerel, so you can feel that. And then you'll just feel a couple of taps on the rod tip. Using circle hooks, what you've got to do is you've got to wait until that rod tip bends. This is an Abu Souveron rod. Don't make them anymore, which is such a shame. This is a great rod for it. Can you pull that as hard as you can? So what you're doing is you're waiting for that rod to go right over like that before you do anything with a circle hook. If you react any earlier than that, you'll pull the bait away from the bass. So you've got to wait until that bass has killed it, come back round again, taking it head first into its mouth, and then as the bass moves off, that tightening will engage the circle hook. So that's the technique that we use. And with braided line, thanks very much, Nigel, fantastic. With braided line, that is the most difficult thing in the world to do. And we screwed it up a lot of times when we were learning. Yeah, circle hooks. If we go to the next one, Tom, thanks. That's where we will typically hook a big bass using circle hooks and live baits. It will either be either side of the mouth or somewhere in the top lip normally, very seldom in the bottom lip. And for some strange reason, when I use single hooks on beach caught fish, quite often I'll hook a bass in the bottom lip, but with circle hooks that doesn't seem to happen. Circle hooks, I would say probably 90% of our bass are returnable using circle hooks, and possibly even higher than that. A bass can take occasionally that circle hook all the way down, and if you do get a deeply hooked bass, if you've got long nose pliers, to take a circle hook out, you don't get it out in the way of a conventional J hook, you just move the thing to the side. And you can have a gut hook bass, just move the hook to the side because of the way the hook's engaged in it, and you can find out that you've actually done very little damage to that bass and it'll go back. So circle hooks for us are the way to go. Yeah. The rather strange gentleman in the left-hand corner is my mate Adam from our fishing club. That bass is really significant. That was the first large float fish bass that we caught on our boat, and it was the first time we ever tried float fishing for bass. So that told us that we were onto something. The picture on the right there is showing the size of the float which I've bought here, and what you can't see with that one is that the circle hook had actually turned into the mackerel, and that bass, quite a stupid ignorant bass, had just held on to it. I got the net under it, got it onto the deck, and it all came apart, and I thought that hook was never in the fish. So we do have a little bit of luck come our way sometimes. These sounder traces. If you look at the two sounder traces, bit of information there that we rely on for our bass fishing. Sounder trace on the left, it's 54 foot deep, so I know which reef that is. It's a slightly deeper reef. The colour on there is bass and bait fish. And if you look at the temperature, it's 64.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a summer trip on a particular mark with the bass showing in a particular way. The one on the right, the bottom right, sea temperature 51 degrees, water depth 40 feet. You'll notice that the bass are showing up a different colour there. They're showing up a green colour. God knows why they show up a green colour on that particular reef, but I can tell you that that's an autumn trip because the temperature's dropped. And for us, anything below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and we will still go fishing for them, but once it gets down to 48, we probably won't catch. So temperature has become a really important thing for us as well. Now, they don't look too bad. Okay. This is a section about trying to explain the thing I said about John Darling, about being very precise on where you put your boat. So this is a fictitious reef. You can study everything you like about where we fish off the Sussex coast and you won't find this shape. I'm not giving any secrets away. And the idea of the black crosses is there's a peak, the yellow crosses, there's a gully, and then there's a bigger peak of rock on the right hand side. Let's assume, Tom, if you go to the next one, thanks. Let's assume that this is north up on your plotter, and we've found on previous trips that the bass, 1 hour into the flood tide, will sit on a particular part of the reef. Now the way that we found that information is by dropping all this information onto our sounder. So we might have had a waypoint for the reef. What we've now gone into is a 0.1 zoom on your plotters, which gives a reasonable amount of detail, and we've dropped marks to show us where the reefs are, where the gullies are, and where we've caught bass. And when we're prospecting places, we might get a bass on, or I might hook a bass, and I'm out of the cabin, and I'll go back into the cabin and I'll reach across to the plotter and I'll drop across on it, because that's an important piece of information. So when we're first going over new ground, we collect all this type of information. The 1 hour into the flood tide, that will have some relevance as I go through these slides. So we come up to a piece of ground, we know typically where the bass will be. That little zone is certainly no bigger than these tables here. That's the sort of area that I'm trying to hit. That's the accuracy on a drift that I'm trying to get to. So tide going from the west, so northeasterly wind, flood tide going up the channel, and then when we put the first drift in to try and get through that area of the bass, or that area of the reef, if you think about the sounder trace on this one wouldn't show up that first peak. It will show up the gully and it will show up the second peak. So if you just looked at the sounder trace, you think you were pretty much in the right sort of area. If we go to the next one. So this second drift, what we know is we're slightly off the mark. We're watching the boat drifting across the ground on the plotter. When I'm fishing, looking through the cabin window and looking at the plotter all the time and looking at the sounder. We keep our sounder on, and I'm looking at that ground and looking at that information. That second drift would show the perfect plot for the right drift. So you get the peak of the first reef, the gully, the peak of the second drift. But if we didn't have all this plotted out, we wouldn't know that we weren't quite on the right spot. And so when you get it all right, you go over the fish and the buggers aren't feeding today. Happens. But if you think about what I've just described there, I've just described 3 drifts. Now, quite often it will take us a little bit longer than that. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter than that, depends on the sea state, the wind state. But time's passing. So this next slide is trying to illustrate that time's passing. Wind has shifted slightly, the tide shifted slightly, you're drifting across the ground in a different way, and quite often the bass move. So there's a lot of hit and miss about this. There's a lot of learning about different states of the tide when the fish are in a particular place. And quite often, up until this is theoretical. What we know is the fish go off the feed. The fish, we go over that mark several times and then they just stop feeding or they move on. So it's if you think about on a good day, on a right mark, we might get half a dozen really good drifts in, really pinpoint, happy drifts in, and that's all you need, because you only need a couple of those, and they turn up a couple of big fish, and that's a good day's fishing.